here is my presentation for Crim 500, and this presentation here coincides with my term paper, and it is over the effects of long-term imprisonment on inmates, especially on release. So some of the defining issues that we're going to go over in this are crimes that brought on incarceration, the prison sentence length, mental health effects, recidivism, the idea of prisonization, and then I have a few examples in there at the end. So, starting off with crimes that brought on imprisonment. When following the aspect of criminality, it's important to first examine what led for these individuals to end up in the penal system. And here are the following categories for that. Banking and insurance, counterfeiting, embezzlement, burglary, larceny, property offenses, continuing criminal enterprise, courts or corrections, drug offenses, extortion, fraud, bribery, homicide, aggravated assault, kidnapping offenses, immigration, miscellaneous, national security, robbery, sex offenses, weapons, explosive, and arson. So this is kind of going over what somebody can do to end up in the criminal justice system. Continuing on with this topic, when looking at a plethora of offenses, it's important to note that in no way are these offenses occurring at a rate similar to one another, meaning that all these different criminal charges and things that can be brought on don't happen at the same rate. There are many more that happen much more often and those that are not so often to be seen. And just for an example of this, drug offenses by far are the leading example of the criminal charges that are brought on. Following this is drug offenses, or weapon offenses rather, explosive, arson, then burglary and larceny and stuff like petty theft. It's important to note that even crimes that are non-violent, such as white-collar offenses, can bring on a very strict penalty, such as imprisonment, and for this portion of my presentation, in an extended amount of time. And as given by the APA, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but it nearly has 25% of its prisoners, so about 2.2 million people in the criminal justice system today, well, more specifically in prison. Meaning the United States has the largest incarceration rate per capita in the world. So, moving on to prison sentence lengths. This portion is very important detail when looking at how the length of an inmate's stay affects their likelihood to reoffend. So looking at how long and the duration of their term is and what that will do to them in the future. Another aspect that must be considered is that state and area of crimes committed, knowing that different states and different locations have higher or lower crime rates based on the certain crime. The majority of those who commit crimes are free in the public, meaning that they're mostly on probation, parole, or they're actually just out in everyday life, but whether there was a fine or, like I said, with probation, they're out in the general population of the public. Continuing on with this topic, when looking at the statistics given by the BOP, most inmates who are incarcerated fall under the term limit year of 5 to 15 years, and that's roughly 70,000 inmates, and this makes up almost half of those who are incarcerated, or 49%. And those serving life terms fall in the 2.6th percentile, and those who are in for a year or less are in the 1.8th percentile. So you kind of get to see that range of people falling in between what the length of stay they have for their crimes. Moving on to mental health issues and effects. This is vital in understanding offenders and why they commit the crimes they do, to better understand if prison is truly helping them or if it's hurting them, especially in this slide from a mental health point of view. It's important to understand that in the community, less than 5% are diagnosed with a severe mental health issue, that being schizophrenia and any other disorders affective disorders that they are diagnosed with. And this doesn't at all coincide with that of the prison population, where it's found that anywhere from 10 to 25% of those incarcerated have severe mental health disorders. Continuing on with this topic, from my knowledge and what I've learned through doing this, it is not a coincidence. There's no coincidence that they have a higher rate of mental health disorders just because they're in prison, or really just trying to understand the cause and the why of it. Through the given statistical survey through the Bureau of Justice, about 24% of state prisoners had a recent history of mental health problems, followed by 21% of those in jail and 14% of those in federal prison. So this statistic is stating that within the last 12 months of their confinement, they had had a mental health disorder brought on that was not previously known before their prison stint. So I think that's very interesting in understanding this whole topic and whether or not confinement and long-term incarceration leads to a benefit for those to re-enter society. Now, a very important point here for the next slide, which is a very big topic discussed among criminal justice professionals and those in corrections, is recidivism. And it is, the true definition of this is a person who relapses into criminal behavior often after the person receives sanction or undergoes intervention for a previous crime. And this is, like I said, has been a very important question in the policing and correctional field. And how do we stop this, and what is making this occur? When looking at a study done by the United States Sentencing Commission, they followed 5 different groups, and they only based it off of their prison stay, so the length of the term they were sentenced to prison. It didn't follow family background, drug use, criminal history. None of that was taken into account, just only looking at this section of their prison stay with this. So let's continue on with that. So their findings were they separated into 3 groups: those who are incarcerated from 12 to 24 months, then those separated from 60 to 120 months, and then the final group was 120 months or longer. So in Group A, it was found that there was no statistical proof that there was any change in the recidivism rate. So they were going to end up in jail or commit a crime and lead them back to the same position they were in at the same rate, as if you can't tell that there's any distinction between them being in and what kind of punishment they were given. Then, with the 60 to 120 months in Group B, roughly 83% of the inmates were reincarcerated in an 8-year span. So it showed a 17% difference, but this was only over an 8-year span that they were able to track this. And then finally, with Group C, which is the longest, 120 months or greater, they still reoffended a 55 to 70% rate, showing that although there might have been slight change, it's nothing significant enough to show that their extended stay stopped the recidivism rate or slowed down their behavior once they were released. Let's continue on. Okay, a big thing that I want to talk about here is prisonization, and the idea of that. I said this is a quandary that has brought me to try and better understand the question of, does long-term imprisonment decrease the likelihood of inmates to reoffend? The term prisonization was first coined by Donald Clemmer in 1940 and was described as a process by which psyches and behaviors of convicts were molded by the social and structural hallmarks of prison life. There are many factors to this, and more so than I even listed here, but trouble returning to everyday life outside of prison, heightened sense of paranoia, irregular eating etiquette, adopted slang, altered sense of reality, and an adopted ideology of physical punishment being the means of consequence. So, through prisonization, the thing I'm trying to analyze here is the idea of putting a person into a setting like prison around other criminals, and in a lot of cases hardened criminals, through a long-term stay, are they adopting habits and behaviors that they wouldn't if there was some other kind of reform that could take place? So, is this another factor causing them to commit more crime? And that's what we're here to discuss and look at. So, lastly, to tie this all in with an example, I have found information on a man by the name of Stephen Avery. And this was a very high sought after case. A lot of people looked at it and were very curious because Stephen Avery, born in 1962 at the age of 18, did come into his first kind of trouble where he robbed a bar. And then at 21, he was convicted with an animal cruelty charge. And then shortly after this, he was arrested and convicted for threatening his cousin, for spreading false rumors about him, he said. While in custody for this, they had a case come up where a woman was raped and kidnapped. And although Stephen Avery had an alibi with 15 eyewitness accounts supporting this, they found him guilty of rape and attempted murder, and they sentenced him to 32 years for this. Well, the problem was, later on a man came forward saying that he committed this crime, and they finally took this into account because he was taken in by the Innocence Project because he always claimed his innocence. So the Innocence Project came in and they re-looked over all the evidence and they found him not guilty. But at this point in time, Stephen Avery had already spent 18 years in prison. And after spending 18 years in prison, that has to bring up the whole idea, as I was talking about, with prisonization. What does this do to somebody? Well, 2 years after he was charged, 2 years after getting out, he was charged with the murder of Teresa Halbach. And they found DNA evidence, and eventually he confessed to this. So although Avery did not have the greatest upbringing and have a great young adulthood where he was on the straight and narrow, you have to ask yourself, he did spend 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. So, did this prisonization and this confinement for this long period of time harden him and make him more liable to go out and commit crimes such as murder? That's what I'm trying to tie in and try and find this out, that he would commit such a heinous act after never doing anything this severe before. Well, to conclude here, and go back to my question, does long-term incarceration directly affect the likelihood of recidivism? And does prisonization have an impact on criminal deviance once released and back into society? Well, I believe that long-term incarceration has shown that it cannot be the sole proprietor to this. You cannot just lock somebody away and not give them the necessary things that they need to be re-entered into society. So I think the idea of halfway houses and rehabilitation centers are necessary because inmates have a harder time readjusting to normal life, and issues and struggles that would occur in prison are often brought home with offenders, especially those who grew up in the penal system and who started acting out at a younger age. And to stymie the recidivism, these treatment facilities and halfway houses, as I said, are paramount to lower and completely cease criminal deviance. Thank you.